Welcome back to Sci-Fi Humanity, where we dive deep into the unknown corners of the universe. Today, we continue our thrilling exploration with studies in dangerous alien life forms. A Xenozoologist's Journal Part 2. Join us as we follow our brave team, including our intrepid Xenozoologist, as they face the terrifying and fascinating creatures of Xerania. If you haven't seen Part 1, be sure to check it out first. Now, let's jump back into the action. I felt a lot better to be back in the open, blue sky above us, and sunlight shining. I was also starting to feel a lot more confident in the humans' ability to take whatever's around had to throw at us. Then I saw the swarm. Species A0522, which had previously frustrated our efforts to survey the area, had finally decided it was time to defend their territory. I saw them a few seconds before the humans, whose eyesight isn't as sharp as an Amia's. I was just about to shout a warning when they noticed them on the drone feed, and immediately the posture of the group changed from casual to alarmed. One of the black suits said we should make a run for the rover, which was 50 meters ahead of us behind a shrub mound, while the swarm was coming from our right. But Mackenzie said we wouldn't make it in time. I wasn't an expert on humans, but they seemed worried. They knew what species A0522 were. They called them dragonflies, and apparently whenever they'd encountered them before it had not been a pleasant experience. I don't know enough about Earth animals to say how close to dragonflies they were, but A0522 are about as long as an adult human's arm. They have 4 translucent wings, and the exoskeleton of this subspecies is an iridescent blue-green. A long tail-like abdomen, but a stubby head that is mostly taken up by 4 bulbous eyes and 4 fangs almost 10 centimeters long. The fangs are grown from a chitinous substance with metallic compounds that are stronger and sharper than steel, and when closed form a beak-like structure with a sharp point. Their main hunting strategy is the simple yet effective dive bombing, impaling their prey as they fly straight into it. At least I'd finally had some proof that the humans were sane, because anyone would be scared of those things. Mackenzie was right. We didn't have time to make a dash for the rover. The dragonflies were already starting their attack run by the time we noticed them. We started backing up towards the mouth of the cave, but we were on rocky ground, and it was difficult to retreat while keeping our eyes on the sky at the same time. The humans started firing their weapons again, and they were almost as loud and as bright as they had been in the confines of the cave. 1 or 2 dragonflies dropped from the sky, but the rest scattered. That was one of the reasons they were so difficult for our probes to deal with. Even equipped with wide-area stunners, they could only take out a few before the swarms spread out and started coming in from every direction, eventually overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Making them scattered did at least slow them down a little. The humans were still firing. Only the black suits, though the white suits were heading for the safety of the cave as fast as possible. You're probably going to think I'm a little slow on the uptake, but remember, I'm a zoologist, not a xenosociologist, and humans were still very new on the galactic scene back then. It was only at this point that I realized that the humans in the heavily armored black suits weren't scientists. I was surrounded by the human hunter caste. Soldiers. In other circumstances, this might have been worrying, but right at that moment I had much bigger problems. The main one being that I was much slower on the ground than my human colleagues. I decided to risk using my jets, just for a short hop. That got me near the cave entrance, but that was as much as I dared. You don't have the finesse with jets that you do with your own wings, and I wasn't about to risk flying into a stalactite. I looked back. The soldiers were still firing as they backed up towards the cave, their explosive weapons firing so rapidly that it was almost one continuous roar. They were working, too, as dragonflies were dropping from the air like fruit in autumn, torn apart in midair. I think the weapons must have been firing some kind of solid projectile. Again, zoologist, not an engineer, which penetrated the exoskeleton easily, but how they were able to hit something so small moving so fast is beyond me. Almost as impressive was their organization. They maintained formation while walking backwards and firing at the same time, seemingly effortlessly. Every few seconds a weapon would go silent, and its operator would eject a cartridge, then insert a new one. Each time, one of their comrades stepped in to cover them, like clockwork. It still wasn't enough, though. There were simply too many dragonflies, and even though they were falling by the dozen, there were hundreds more. They were starting to cluster again, getting ready to make a final dive. Instinctively, the swarm knew that they were harder to stop when attacking together rather than piecemeal. I started climbing back through the stalagmites. The humans in the white suits, my fellow scientists, were almost at the mouth of the cave and would probably make it. But I didn't like the chances of the black-suited soldiers. I willed them to hurry. Every instinct I had said they should turn and make a run for it. But then all my instincts were predicated on having wings. If they stayed out in the open, the swarm would overwhelm them. And if they tried to run, the swarm would chase them down before they reached safety. A horrible nausea arose in the pit of my stomach. I had no choice but to watch, helpless, as the horror unfolded. I really hoped they would live. And not just because the AMIA Science Consortium would probably find a way to blame me if the first joint AMIA human expedition was a disaster. But it wasn't looking good. Then I noticed that the formation was changing. Most of the soldiers were still backing up, but the two who were carrying devices similar to my chemical sampler, the rod with the wide nozzle, had stopped and raised them to point at the swarm. I just had time to think, I wonder what they do, when suddenly there was fire. With a whoosh, 2 arcs of flame came fontaining out of the nozzles. It was loud, and it was bright, and it was so hot that even though I was some way behind them, I could feel the glare on my face. They hit the swarm dead center. It broke apart again, dragonflies darting out in every direction to escape the liquid fire. Many of them plummeted straight to the ground, burning bright as torches, while others twisted through the air trailing flame. Apparently, whatever fuel the flamethrowers used, it was very sticky as well as highly flammable. The Xeranian predators had attacked in complete silence, apart from the buzzing of their wings. But now, they were shrieking. And still, they weren't giving up. Like most of the native fauna, they were highly territorial, hyper-aggressive, and they wouldn't stop until they were feasting on the interlopers. That was what was so interesting about Xerania from an academic perspective, and so much less stimulating when you were actually standing on the planet. The dragonflies that hadn't been hit were wheeling back to line themselves up again for a dive. The remaining humans were almost at the cave, but they were out of time. One of the soldiers had to throw himself to the ground to avoid one aimed straight at his head, barely getting down before he was decapitated. The creature embedded itself in the rock behind him, its razor-sharp fangs penetrating several centimeters. It buzzed angrily as it tried to free itself. There was another thump, much nearer me, and I saw a dragonfly similarly stuck in a stalagmite. Another impacted a few meters away. The swarm must have been so disoriented, it was throwing itself forward no matter what. It was time to stop worrying about the fate of the humans, which I couldn't do anything about, and make sure my own feathers weren't about to get plucked. I finished climbing through the entrance of the cave and picked the largest, thickest stalagmite to hide behind. Not a moment too soon. More and more dragonflies were thudding into the jagged rock formations. I could still hear the humans firing outside, but the firing began to dwindle. Then I saw black-suited humans among the stalagmites, likewise taking cover. I couldn't count them all from my vantage point, but it seemed like at least a few had made it. The swarm continued to throw itself at the mouth of the cave. Most of the dragonflies smashed into the stalagmites and stalactites, either embedding their fangs in the soft limestone or just bouncing off with a nasty crunch. A few made it through into the cave, but it seemed like their vision wasn't very good in the dark. Some of them flew around aimlessly, while others became fascinated by the tail lights of species C0083. Some of the C0083s decided they wanted to see what dragonfly tasted like, which ended badly for both parties. Although they could catch them, they couldn't swallow them, and locked in a fatal wrestling match. Several were pulled off the ceiling, which was a boon for us, although I refrained from saying so until I knew how many of the humans were dead. Once the last of the dragonflies had either been snared or flown off, Dr. Reed and I collected a few specimens under the watchful eyes of several of the soldiers. Then they herded myself and the 4 human scientists out of the cave. I expected to see bodies on the ground. There were none, or at least no human ones. Big and flightless they may be, but evidently along with everything else, they're surprisingly agile as well. They had survived the swarm completely unscathed. I thought. Then I turned my head and saw that one of the soldiers had a dragonfly through his thigh. It had penetrated all the way through and was stuck, wriggling and gnashing its fangs. Being a xenozoologist, you develop a strong constitution. Dissections are still an essential part of the profession, after all. But there was something about the way it was struggling to squirm its way out of the bloody wound that made me, well, I was very close to having the contents of my stomach splattered over the inside of my helmet. Then one of the other soldiers shouted, "Hey look, Velasquez has made a friend." The noises the other humans made were flagged as laughter by my translation software. Somehow, the little humor was enough to make me feel a little better. It at least indicated that he probably wasn't going to die. I'm not sure how well it worked for Velasquez. His response was, "Shut up and get it out of me." Mackenzie said something and the laughter stopped abruptly. Several of the soldiers replied yes. Team leader, almost as if by rote. There was some context there that my translator wasn't picking up. I pulled up the base audio files and ran a more complex analysis of their responses. What they were actually saying was, "Yes, Major." My translation software kept trying to parse that as team leader, but it was a specifically military term. We didn't have a full index of human military hierarchies, but from what I could tell it was a senior officer, and anyone lower down the hierarchy was expected to obey any order from her immediately, no matter how dangerous, on threat of severe punishment. Major Mackenzie might well be the most dangerous thing on Zerania at that moment. And that was saying something. Unfortunately for Velasquez, the Major decided that it was too risky to remove it there and then, and they'd need to carry him back to the rover. They did at least cut the dragonfly's head off, which caused my stomach to do another backflip. And apparently the flamethrowers had another purpose, because everywhere Velasquez's blood had spilled was incinerated, sterilizing any foreign microorganisms that might otherwise infect the biosphere. They did at least have some understanding of proper scientific procedure. Once we were back in the rover and had a proper medical kit, they were able to extract the alien carnivore from their comrade's leg. I assumed that the expedition was over. Velasquez surely needed immediate medical evacuation, but the assessment of the team's medic was that it was only a flesh wound, and that as it hadn't cut any arteries, he was in no immediate danger. Give him enough painkillers, and he could wait for a while. Of course, I knew humans were resilient. The overview of human anatomy was about the only part of the briefing file from the Science Consortium I understood, and damn was it interesting reading for a xenozoologist. But evidently, the Science Consortium didn't have any information on how humans responded to serious injury, because I was surprised, to put it mildly. Any Amia who'd suffered a similar wound would either have died from shock immediately or be catatonic. Velasquez was clearly in pain, but he was still lucid and communicative. Apart from the obvious limp, he didn't seem impaired at all. In fact, so long as he wasn't required to move around, he could still have defended himself, probably better than me. I was starting to understand why this expedition had been given the go-ahead by the Science Consortium so easily. Our knowledge of humans was still very limited, and this was the sort of thing it was important to know. I knew I was supposed to make a report on the humans, but now it was becoming clear exactly which details my seniors would be looking most closely at. Expanding our knowledge of Zerania was a nice side benefit, but the dragonflies weren't about to develop spaceflight anytime soon. It was the newest spacefaring species in the galaxy that the Science Consortium were really interested in, and the question they were most concerned about was, Exactly how dangerous are these things? And the answer seemed to be that they were frighteningly strong, tough, organized, and capable of inflicting violence. However, in my opinion, that wasn't necessarily all that worrying. After all, much of our technology could be extremely lethal if used improperly. Strength wasn't necessarily dangerous. It depended on how it was used. And it was only now, halfway through this expedition into an insanely hostile wilderness, that enlightenment finally dawned. I was the canary in the fucking coal mine. To borrow a human expression, humans are nice when they're a diplomatic embassy in a comfortable environment, but how does their hunter caste behave towards Amia, especially when they're under stress? That was the real question, and if the answer turned out to be that they got a lot nastier, then the science consortium evidently thought I was an acceptable loss to find that out. Bastards. Fortunately for me, fortunately for all of us, really, the humans had passed the test with flying colors. Not only had they not turned on me, they had very successfully stopped me from being shish kebabed by the local wildlife. In fact, at this point I was feeling considerably more warmly to them than my own species. The expedition continued for another 4 stops without further incident, the rover trundling along through the shrub forest as calmly as a sightseeing tour. Although I was now aware that what I'd thought was my mission to be was somewhat redundant, I still collected a lot of amazing samples. In fact, for a Xenozoologist, it was a great day out, or it would have been without the constant fear of violent death waiting around the corner. It was on the 5th and final stop that we encountered trouble again. We wanted to take samples from a swampy area, which meant parking the rover some way off again lest it get bogged down. Since I was the only one capable of flying, I suggested that the rest of the team wait at the edge of the swamp while I quickly nipped in and out, but Major Mackenzie absolutely refused to let me go in alone. So I was there hovering just above the water, collecting samples, guarded by 4 human soldiers in water up to their waist. One of them had the bioscanner. We'd been at it about 5 minutes before it started picking up something. It was right at the edge of the scanner's range, so very calmly we turned around and started heading for the shore. The soldiers with me signaled the rest of the military escort, who spread out along the edge of the water, weapons raised. Whatever the scanner was picking up didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. Better to take as many precautions as possible, though. Then the swamp started bubbling. We were about halfway to the shore when the water exploded upwards. I turned at the sound and wished I hadn't. Something was hauling itself up out of the swamp, mud cascading off it. It must have buried itself in the boggy bottom layer of waterlogged earth, because standing up it was at least 3 meters high, not to mention almost as long as the rover. Even as the behemoth started stomping towards us, the zoologist part of my brain was taking notes. Double thorax, 8 legs, it was walking on 4 of them, while the upper 4 picked bits of swamp weed off its carapace. Relatively thick, fat segments. The abdomen was bulbous to the point of almost being spherical. Its mouth parts were protected by 4 armor petals. They were now opening to reveal the ring of its mouth sphincter, which was studded with teeth. The non-zoologist part of my brain made it very clear that, interesting or not, I needed to put as much distance between myself and this thing as possible. I needed more power to my suit jets. Much more power. At this point, I was asking myself why I'd felt the need to volunteer to be the one to go into the swamp. Sure, I was the most qualified, and there were some really interesting samples. But with a ring of chomping teeth rapidly closing in on me, suddenly the new species of mudworm I'd collected didn't seem quite as important. The things I do for science. I wasn't really the one who was in trouble, though. I sped away, skimming across the water. The suit jets might not be as good as wings, but it could at least fly straight and level. I thought about simply going up, but in my mind's eye, I saw myself escaping the clutches of the lumbering swamp thing only to get snatched out of the air by one of the multitude of aerial predators. It didn't really matter, though, because either way I was faster than the 4 humans, who were struggling through the water and mud a lot slower than the beast coming up behind them. The soldiers on the shore opened fire. Having seen what those weapons could do, I did not like staring at the front end, So it was a mark of how much I trusted the humans at this point that I kept heading towards them. Or at least a mark of how much I didn't want to find out whether the swamp dweller would kill me before or after it started eating me. But I was right to have faith in them because the humans didn't so much as scratch me. I reached the shore and stopped, jets throwing up a spray of water as I braked. I turned to see how my 4 escorts were getting on. And the answer was, not well. The humans' weapons also weren't so much as scratching the massive swamp creature, but in this case it wasn't for lack of trying. The thing's carapace was just too thick. A jet of flame burst out, arcing over the heads of the fleeing humans, but the creature, protected by a layer of boggy slime as well as its armored exoskeleton, seemed unfazed by it. The behemoth's upper limbs were already reaching over its head for the fleeing soldiers, 4 clawed feet snapping. It wasn't quite there yet, but it was close. One of the soldiers beside me shouted "grenade," and there was a phut followed by a small explosion just behind the creature's head. Again, it didn't even seem to notice. To my shock, it was looking like the humans had finally met their match. Major Mackenzie ordered 2 of her team to take me and the 4 other scientists and get out of there. I could hear in the background that she was talking to the rover crew on another comm channel. The 4 white-suited humans and I were quickly hustled away, but I couldn't help but look back at the soldiers who were still struggling to make it out of the swamp. They were almost at the shoreline, but so was the creature chasing them. It would be close, if they made it at all. My heart felt like it had climbed up into my esophagus, and all my feathers were standing on end. The tension was unbearable. I was so reluctant to tear my eyes away that I was facing backwards as I hovered away. A really bad idea, I know, but I had to see what happened. There was another grenade explosion on the carapace, which barely even left a mark. But then someone must have scored a lucky hit on its fleshy mouthparts, because the creature flinched. However, that only slowed it down for a second or two before it lowered its head and kept going. To my immense relief, I saw the humans reach the shoreline, their comrades grabbing their hands to haul them out of the murky water. Finally, they started to back away from the swamp, continuing to fire. Once the last soldier was out, they turned and started running. It was too late, though. The swamp creature was at the shoreline too, clawing its way out onto the somewhat drier ground, and even though the humans were picking up speed, they still weren't as fast as the monster charging towards them. Then something incredibly bright flashed past me. It hit the creature in its bulbous abdomen, and tore right through it, and out the other side. A second later, I heard the roar of an explosive blast, and felt the shockwave wash over me. I stopped, more out of surprise than anything else. Another shot snapped past me, and took one of the creature's upper legs off. Just cut clean through it, sent it spinning the way into the dirt. Again, the sound of the blast followed a moment later. Even through my suit, it was loud enough to make me dizzy. And then a third shot flashed over me, and hit the behemoth in the head. A spray of liquefied meat burst from the exit wound. The creature took one step, then another, then collapsed to the ground with an earth-shaking thump. What the hell was that? I turned and saw the rover. It had forced its way through the tangle of vegetation at the edge of the wetland, and backed up until the rear trailer, whose wheels were now half sunk into the soft ground, was in sight of us. On its roof, the metal tube poking out of the turret had a thin wisp of smoke rising from it. I'd already worked out that the observation turrets must actually be for weapons, probably for larger versions of what the humans were carrying. But theory was one thing, seeing it in action was quite another. Still, I might be shaken, but I was alive, and so was everybody else. That was the important thing. The last shreds of my commitment to low-impact, ecologically sensitive science were gone, but somehow I doubted the humans would care. And to be honest, if the alternative was a dinner date with the local apex predator, then I wasn't that bothered either. Even so, I still spent the rest of the trip terrified of the firepower we were carrying around. A big stunner is one thing, but that cannon could take down a small spaceship, and we were sitting right underneath it. Actually, no, that wasn't what terrified me. What really got to me happened after we made it back to the drop site, just before the shuttle picked us up. We were making idle conversation while we waited for the shuttle to arrive, and I mentioned that the Science Consortium would never give us the budget to develop such an impressive array of custom weaponry. If we couldn't do it with off-the-shelf stunner drones, then we'd never get the funding for an expedition. They were lucky they had such a scientifically minded government. Major Mackenzie replied, offhand, as if it was no big deal, that all the equipment was standard military hardware. There was a second or two where my gears in my brain spun as I tried to work out why anyone would need that kind of hardware if not for this kind of expedition. It's not like worlds as dangerous as Xerania are common, and I was pretty sure humans had never visited any of the others we knew about. Then it hit me. They designed these things to use on each other. I was very quiet when I got back to our orbital station. I greeted my colleagues, completely refrained from giving the backstabbing bastards a piece of my mind, and locked myself away in my quarters to write my report to the Science Consortium. I tried to be as honest as I could, not letting any of the more sensational details obscure my generally positive impressions, while at the same time not leaving out anything no matter how strange or unsettling. My final opinion on humans: I liked them. They were friendly, accommodating, anxious to make sure I was safe and eager to pursue the cause of science together. I could even see myself remaining friends with some of them, particularly Dr. Reed. They are, in many ways, quite easy to deal with, and I can see a mutually beneficial relationship developing between our two species in the future. But by all the stars, they scare the shit out of me. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey through Xerania in Studies in Dangerous Alien Lifeforms. A Xenozoologist's Journal Part 2. Our team faced incredible dangers, showcasing the resilience and ingenuity of humanity. If you enjoyed this adventure, please give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest stories from the frontier of science fiction. Until next time, keep exploring the unknown with Sci-Fi Humanity.